It had been a bad week at the office, but the week had now finished and the engineer was about to make the return journey from the Mars headquarters to Earth. The duration would take between 3 minutes and 7, but the actual time would depend on the distance between the planets and their relative orbits around the Sun. However, to the consciousness of the one making the crossing, it's perceived as instantaneous, as their identity line is broken on the Mars side and then immediately reconnected on the other. The person that stepped out on Earth would never even remember the 200 or so million kilometers in space that had just been crossed, and then would continue on with their lives as if nothing had ever happened at all. In most cases, the crossing was quicker than the usual terrestrial work commute. It was a marvelous technology based on some complex mathematics and scientific models, and it was now all the trend to become a teletransportation engineer. The tech was not an industry standard, as the machines were still too inefficient to be used on a wide scale, and as such, it was only reserved for use off-world. The engineer was one of the few who actually worked on the machines, rather than learning about them at a distance. She supposed she was thankful for that, but what she was most thankful for now was that the week was finally over. She stepped into the machine and sighed. This was the weekly routine. Into the machine on Earth, spend the rest of the week on maintenance on Mars, and then teletransporting back on the weekend. It started off as rather exciting, as most never had the chance to see a working teletransporter, let alone make the crossing. However, as the months and years rolled on, and the engineer remained in the same role as when she started, the whole thing became rather mundane. She was sure the hovercar was the most brilliant thing ever to be invented when it first came out in the last century, but no one even blinked when they saw them now. Most have one and most have more, and any new invention quickly loses its charm. That was how the world worked, and humans would always be fickle creatures. Nothing was about to change there. Any new technology, no matter how miraculous it was, could only remain interesting for a short time. But little did the engineer know, things were about to become a lot more interesting indeed, and her world would never be the same again. Monday came around quick, as it often did, and the engineer arrived dead on time at the teletransportation deck. Before you could step into the machine and make the crossing, there were safety checks and insurance documents to sign in case something was to happen with either machine, not that it did. The machines were created with such mathematical and scientific precision that it was near impossible for them to fail. Not zero, but something like 1 in trillions, and there was nowhere near that many crossings for that number to strike anyone with much concern. It was much safer than hovercars. Still, mistakes did still happen now and then, and the universe had an odd way of teasing them out. Some called it fate, some called it karma, but the engineer saw it as bad engineering, and that would be a mindset that would haunt her in a few short moments. Perhaps that was the real karma of the situation, hiding just out of sight in the unseen. After signing the documents which confirmed that the engineer was alright with her identity line broken and recreated, she stepped into the machine. Teletransporters worked on quantum mechanics, which was developed in the 20th century, but really blossomed in the 22nd, when the quirks had mostly been ironed out. In particular, it relied upon the phenomenon of quantum entanglement, where two particles were spontaneously generated that were linked together, no matter how far the distance was between them. The details were perhaps a little difficult for anyone that wasn't a trained quantum engineer, but the basic idea was that if teletransporters could make use of the entangled particles, then we could transport humans across massive distances. Mars was as far as we had got, but it was a good start. That was all simple, but it was the crossing that was difficult. Once the engineer stepped into the machine, it scanned her atomic composition and recorded this information inside the machine's computerized brain. This is the information that would be sent across space to Mars, and then the machine on the other side would recreate her atomic structure, with local stores of carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, and all the other elements that are required to make a human body. Before this atomic information was sent across, however, the original atomic matter was destroyed inside the machine, and this was what made the engineer a little queasy when she first learned about them, as well as most of the population who objected to their creation. All these thoughts ran around in the engineer's mind as she stepped into the machine, but she knew that it was safe and sound. She closed her eyes and waited for the crossing. However, when the engineer stepped back out of the machine, expecting to be met with the dull blackness of the skies over Mars, she instead saw the same blue atmosphere that she was used to on Earth, and a little red dot in the heavens. Immediately, she knew that something must have happened, a malfunction with one of the machines. Perhaps the quantum entanglement between the two teletransporters had been severed, or the scan had failed to complete. However, when she stepped onto the teletransportation deck, much to the bewildered faces of the colleagues that operated the machines, all the diagnostics showed that the crossing had been achieved successfully. What on earth could have happened? As the engineer would soon find out, that was the wrong question to ask. The question should have been, what on Mars just happened? At the very same time as the engineer was running diagnostics on the machine, an identical copy stepped out onto the teletransportation deck on Mars, and she was already on her way to the office. It wasn't long before the anomaly was detected, and the news travelled fast around both colonies. It was the first time in recorded history that such a malfunction had occurred with one of the teletransporters, and it was making headlines the world's over. Objectors to the advancement of teletransportation tech were protesting and rioting in the streets, and the scientists inside their labs were anxiously scribbling on holoboards, attempting to work out what could have happened. The engineer had always believed that the probability for failure was too low to be considered a threat, and yet there she was, on both Earth and Mars at the same time. Soon enough, she was pulled away for interrogation. "I don't understand," the engineer said. "I can't be in two places at once. That's just impossible. It breaks all the rules of logic. The machines never malfunction, not like this." "I'm afraid on this occasion that they have," the silhouette replied. "I understand that you must be, well, divided, to say the least. One could say you're in two minds about the whole situation." "Alright, sorry, that was probably not what you needed at this moment. Look, we just need to ask you a few questions to see if we can figure all this out. This event is already making headline news all over the colonies, and as you might have guessed, all the crossings have stopped since this little mishap. The world, it seems, has come to a standstill. So we would appreciate it very much if we could have your full cooperation to understand this situation better." "Sure," the engineer said. "I'll answer the questions you have." "Excellent. Before we start, have you ever heard of the ship of Theseus?" "Of course," the engineer replied. "It's one of the first things all quantum engineers have to learn before we can start working on the machines. It's a thought experiment in metaphysics. There was once a ship that belonged to Theseus, the Greek warrior and hero, that accompanied him on all his travels. The crew noticed that some of the wooden planks had rotted, and so those planks were removed and replaced with new ones. This happened again and again until eventually, all the wooden planks from the original ship had been replaced. The question then became, was it still the original ship of Theseus? It's an old myth that we have to learn because it teaches us the importance of identity." "Right, identity. That's the real issue at stake here. We need to determine the identity of the person that stepped out onto the teletransportation deck on Mars. Unfortunately, this question is impossible for your scientists to solve, so we had to call in the philosophers on this one. You see, as I'm sure you well know, the Theseus example is not too different from how the teletransporters work, at least in a superficial sense. But instead of wooden planks, the machines replace the cells in your body, atom by atom. In the case of teletransportation, where your entire body is destroyed and then recreated, it seems clear that the person that comes out on the other side is a different person. I mean, if we swap Theseus' ship wholesale with a new one, there would be no way we could call it the same boat. You agree?" "I'm not sure. Like you said, the resemblance between Theseus and the machines is superficial, and there's one key difference between me and the wooden planks. I mean, there's a few, but this is hardly the time for that. Sure, it's true that bodies are destroyed and then recreated on the other side, but that doesn't change the fact that when I do actually step out on the other side, I still feel like the same person. The machine does a full scan and then recreates the body in the same atomic state it was in before the crossing. That means that all the neurons in my brain are recreated as well, and so I still have all the same memories and experiences that I had before. My consciousness feels unbroken, that there was a continuous identity line before and after the crossing. The wooden planks on the ship of Theseus don't have a subjective experience of their persistence through time, but I do. Memories and experience must count for something, right? I see what you mean, the silhouette replied, and paused to smoke his cigarette. I think you're pointing towards what us philosophers call the ego theory. It's the idea that we can explain the identity of a person with reference to that person being the continued subject of all her experiences. Unfortunately, this idea lost some of its favour with advances in neuroscience. Whether your identity line feels unbroken or not is irrelevant. That doesn't change the fact that it was still broken. In a sense, the crossing is no different to when you fall asleep and wake up, or when you're anaesthetised for an operation. Sure, it feels as though no time has passed at all, but it has. And even though you feel like the same person when you wake up, there's no guarantee that's what happened. It could simply be the case that whenever we fall asleep and wake up, we're replaced with an identical copy with the exact same memories and experiences, just like what happened here. The engineer paused for a second and tried to wrap her head around the whole situation. Mathematics and science meant nothing now, as she was faced with the bare realization of what had happened today. It was so alien and improbable, but at the same time, there was something dreadfully human about the whole situation. Look, I don't really understand all this stuff. I'm a quantum engineer, not a philosopher. Quite frankly, I'm not in the correct mindset to have all these deep conversations about metaphysics and identity. Does the question even matter? Who cares about whether I'm the same person after I make the crossing or not? That's the issue with all you philosophers. You get too worried and worked up about every little detail, and in the end, it doesn't even matter. If there's a decent enough resemblance between the two, then isn't that enough to call me the same person I was before the crossing? I have the same body, the same thoughts, the same memories, and the same experiences. Surely we can abandon the problem and be done with it. The silhouette thought about this response, and then had an idea. It's just like what our Lord and Saviour said. The Buddha, not the weird one with the cross. Whether you die when you step into the machine and are born again on the other side, or whether you continue to exist as your identity line remains unbroken, it's sort of an empty question. We can't explain the existence of a unitary consciousness by the existence of a person. Instead, all we can claim is that there are a series of mental states and processes all tied together with a loose thread. Perhaps that thread is memory, and perhaps it's something else, but for all intents and purposes, a person dies every moment and is reborn again when something different happens in their mind. When we sleep and wake, when we have a new idea, when some of our cells die and are replaced, when we fall in love or experience heartbreak, when we do literally anything, there is no such thing as a person, a single consciousness, over and above the mental and physical states that occur. Calling someone a person is just a fact of language, a convenient fiction that we've made up so we don't have to face the immediate reality of the universe so harshly. So when you're destroyed in the one machine and then recreated in the other, it's not much different than just being human. It might be strange and weird and bizarre, but perhaps the question of whether you're the same person or not really is just an empty question. In fact, even living from moment to moment is the same as making the crossing to Mars, or halfway across the solar system, or halfway across the universe. In the end, I suppose you're right. The question doesn't even matter, and when it comes down to it, we should be happy with that answer. The engineer sat back in her chair, not knowing whether she was herself or whether there was any place for her in the universe. She ran her hands down her legs and wondered whether they were really there, and whether that really mattered at all. In the end, she decided it didn't, and a notable look of despair flashed across her face. The future seemed so uncertain, as did everything else. There was no stable ground for anything, nothing upon which to build. The universe was in a constant flux, and at this moment, the engineer was caught in the crossfire. The silhouette noticed this, and his stare melted a little. Alright, thank you for your time. We can end the session here. I can see that it's been difficult for you. But before we finish, there is one more thing. Freeze all motor functions. The engineer slumped to the table as her motor cortex shut down. The pneumatic pumps in her limbs decompressed, and then the engineer was as dead as an android with its battery removed. The silhouette took a final drag on his cigarette and made some notes on his clipboard before leaving the interrogation room. He picked up the microphone, and his voice echoed through the loudspeakers.
Okay, simulation 42 has been successfully completed, same results as the last few times. Let's reprogram the memories again to see if we can preserve self-identity a little more. Just a few more tests, and I'm sure we can crack safe and reliable teletransportation. Run the simulation again.